receive any such request where we can be helpful to all our investors in Pakistan, as well as those who want to import from USA to Western Coast. Thank you very much.
Gee, thank you, Jabbar Sahab. Okay, so now to sort of formally kick off the proceedings, as is the norm with fireside chats, Taimur, we'd like to start off with something slightly, let's say, less formal. And you know, having seen your profile, I think people like you, Asad Umar Saab, they brought in a lot of young Pakistanis, you know, back into sort of taking interest in the overall political landscape for the country. And I was just curious to know your unique journey from the corporate sector to the political sphere. You know, did GK, LBS, and McKinsey prepare you well for your foray into the political landscape of Pakistan?
Gee, I think that having lived abroad for about 15 years before coming in, you know, I'm always keen to connect with people from the diaspora. And I'd like to thank you all for inviting me. I'd like to thank the Consul General for his kind remarks. And we'll hopefully be using his services as well. To answer your question, look, obviously, I think everything in life that you do prepares you for what's next if you want to. And I think it has been an interesting journey. If you ask me anywhere along the line whether I would at some point be sitting as a representative of government, I wouldn't have been able to answer that. But something that I can tell you that I've always wanted to do while we being based abroad is to contribute to Pakistan. And so in that sense, it is something that I feel that there was an ambition, and I am living that ambition. Does something like my background, whether that's GIK, I had a mechanical engineering degree from there. I spent 6 years in the oil and gas business. I then did an MBA from London Business School, spent almost a decade at McKinsey, became a partner there. Does all of that prepare you? Of course it does, because ultimately we need good talent that has seen the world to come back and try and fix what we feel is wrong in our country. And I think to that context, it is important that in terms of people who come back and work in Pakistan, that there's a blend, right? That we have a blend of people that is helping to run things in the country, that includes people who have something to offer from what they've seen and done in the world. Yes. And that certainly includes people who are born and bred and lived and have experienced every second of their life in Pakistan. I think there's space for everyone. But what I do think is, and this is what I'll say is that, and this has always been a strong thought, that if you feel that you have something to contribute, and if you feel that you've been blessed enough to be able to give something back, however difficult the circumstances or challenging it may seem to change a place like Pakistan, I've always felt that one has an obligation to try. And that is what actually drove me. So it actually felt like everything that I'd done, the experience that I had, and the fact that I came from a background where I could afford to take risk and come back, and I felt that I'd achieved enough that it almost didn't matter if I succeeded or I didn't succeed. It is important that enough of us get together and change what we think needs to be changed about Pakistan. And in that sense, certainly every second of my life prepared me for this.
No, that's very invigorating to hear for a lot of us who currently are still based abroad. And as you would recall from your times in Dubai or in London, that a lot of times when Pakistanis get together abroad, the gathering, somehow the conversation goes towards, how can we go back? How can we contribute? And I think a credit to the current government in the country, where after a long time, we sort of feel like we've got a voice on the table. We're heard, and the government's doing things to facilitate our involvement in the country in terms of bringing in simple steps like this recent initiative with the federal government's initiative around the Roshan Pakistan account, that you can, while sitting abroad, with literally an online workflow, open accounts back home and start sending money back. And I mean, small things like that, they show that desire on part of the government to make us feel heard and involved in taking the country forward. I think on that note, now sort of zooming in a bit into your sort of provincial canvas, I recently read that your government's public satisfaction survey ratings were amongst the provinces the highest. You got a 60%, a 61% rating versus 48 and 39% for a couple of other key provinces in the country. Now, what for you has been the sort of the magic sauce in KP? What's been your most sort of fulfilling achievement so far with the provincial leadership hat on?
So, if we take COVID as an example, because the ratings that you're referring to recently were published in the context of COVID.
Yeah.
I think the magic sauce is transparency and integrity. There have been a large number of times where the pressure has been there to try and package or market stuff. KP was showing a higher number of deaths than other provinces. And we are in for a lot of criticism, and we felt that it was partly down to the fact that we were actually reporting to a different standard. And of course, there's a little bit of pressure to say, should we be reporting the same way if we believe that not everyone is reporting equally? And we actually withstood that pressure, right? And then as, say, the data got better, the one thing that we haven't done is, because other provinces did this, is to say, look, our data is better. Every time someone's flashed a slide saying the deaths in KP are lower now, why don't you say it? On some things, you don't want to tempt fate or market what you have or haven't done. We've worked very hard during COVID. We've worked hard to educate the public. We've worked hard within limited capacity to build the capacity to deal with this. We've worked hard to explain every time a question has been asked, or to fix every time we feel we've made a mistake. We built our testing capacity. We put in place a rapid response team infrastructure that was driven by technology and a single call center in the province. But we didn't try and overmarket because the whole idea here was there's a crisis going on. We're not competing with other provinces. We're not trying to show ourselves to be good. We're trying to respond to a crisis. And I believe that what has paid off in the satisfaction ratings, and I'm not just talking of myself, I think this actually starts with the dignified way in which the Chief Minister has presented or led our response, right? You will not have seen through this crisis.
Great. And building on that, you mentioned, that there were certain telehealth and mobile health initiatives that, help with your cause in terms of, giving swift relief and support to the public. We obviously are a community of entrepreneurs, technologists, some students as well. So what would your message be to those sitting abroad in terms of any specific aspects of the healthcare delivery value chain where we could focus and help not just the KP government, other provincial governments in delivering on your agenda when it comes to health in Pakistan?
If I may be allowed to take this a little bit more generally around how the foreign diaspora can help Pakistan, because it's something that I always wanted to do while based abroad, and then we can double down on health as and when required. Let me answer in two parts. First, to tell you how actually the medical community in the US actually did play an important role in some of our hospitals where, because in particular in the big hospitals in Peshawar, one of them where the chairman of the board is Dr. Naushirwan Barki, who is the chairman also of the Health Task Force, travels from the US to Pakistan every month. When we saw gaps in delivery, we actually set up for some of these hospitals connectivity with peers in the US that allowed them to improve treatment protocols and the like live on a day-by-day basis. We had help, of course, in terms of building some of our technology platforms. So actually during COVID, the diaspora, and specifically the diaspora in the US, helped directly with what we did. But I think in general, if you ask what some of the people who are sitting out there can actually help with in terms of Pakistan, let me just start off by saying, I don't think it's necessary that you move back immediately. I think if there's something that hopefully I bring to the table as I come back and try and serve the country through a career as a politician, it's actually made up by the fact that I have actually spent 20 years in a different profile, building my capabilities. And I think the Bay Area is a place specifically in that's relevant to this, is just this technology space. And I wouldn't just limit it to health, because health is a relatively technical field in terms of what you can and can't do, and perhaps the best way to contribute is by contributing financially to the right forums. But let me just ask a question. Which is the fastest growing market, or at least pre-COVID, which was the fastest growing market for Kareem, founded by Mudassar Sheikha, a friend, an ex-colleague at McKinsey, and someone who spent a large amount of time in the Bay Area before he moved to the Middle East. And that market is Pakistan. And that is a great example of the sort of service that can be enabled by technology, and where simply the gap that exists in Pakistan means that something that is established outside has a space there, or people who actually know how something like this can work can actually come in and start actually picking up something entrepreneurial in Pakistan in this technology space. This is a space that I do find exciting, and where our local ecosystem is picking up and consists of a number of people who have either studied abroad, and worked abroad and come back, and indeed who are local homegrown products, right? That is certainly one example of sort of looking where there's opportunity for those of you who are interested in coming back and trying to take that risk over here. And where there's detriments and challenges as well, there is opportunity here, because there are many sectors, many products, many services which should work in Pakistan, but the market is open. So I think that is one major sort of thought on potentially investing here. The other thing for those in established businesses is, can you actually employ people in Pakistan? Because there's a lot of talent. There's certainly a lot of talent in Peshawar. There's a lot of talent in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Some of it is raw, and it's one thing to it's one thing to do. It's one thing to take the big leap to come back. Not everyone will be at the stage of their careers to do that. But I've got friends in the Bay Area with relatively small to medium-sized ventures that are consciously employing in Pakistan. And I think whether that's 1 or 2 or 10 or 20 or 50 or 100 people, depending on the size of venture that you're a part of, I think that is something that whether, by the way, you're a business owner, a partner, or even an employee that can pitch to whoever they are working for to say, look, there's a market. If we need, for example, outsourced services, we don't just need to hire. India is not the only option in town. There's another country with equally good talent, perhaps with better talent and more hunger, that is open. And that is a place to pitch. I can tell you that when I was at McKinsey, in this sort of spirit, one of my contributions was expanding the Pakistan recruitment from just LUMS to about 6 different universities, which then led to the creation of a Pakistan office. And I was talking to an ex-colleague a couple of days ago, and as I understand, they now recruit in a lot more than the 6 that I actually left. And that actually has a real and tangible impact on the market. And we can't just let these big firms be the only one that are coming and recruiting from Pakistan. So that is another area that I would really, really urge everyone who's on the call to think of the talent that they can tap, because we're not just looking to train people once. We're looking to groom the next Mudassir Sheikha, and we're looking to groom the next founder of FireEye, and we're looking to groom, the next set of people like you who can scale up the impact that Pakistan and Pakistanis can have globally.
That's really encouraging. And as you said, there's multiple ways in which those from the diaspora can contribute back, depending on what stage in life they're at. There's a specific question from the audience in terms of how private publics partnerships can be forged in this context. So are there specific government departments that are working in this space? So for someone sitting abroad in the audience today wanting to connect back with the government in terms of a private sector contribution to bringing the public sector forward in terms of, be it automation, robotic process automation initiatives, anything of that sort. If something comes up, who do we reach out to? I guess there are some good incubators like NIC, there's Plan 9, I think KPIT boards also set up a few platforms. So how would you encourage someone to go a bit deeper and more specific in this space?
So I don't think there's an easy answer to that, sadly, and that's where the scope and the need for improvement starts to come, right? And I think that is an evolving process. I can tell you that when I decided to come back, I reached out through personal contacts to try and get a sense of whether I'd be accepted by PTI or not. And it was more, there was no sort of set path. It was initiative. I can tell you that when Tanya Idrus, who unfortunately is not serving in government, but is still, determined to serve in Pakistan, came back, it actually started off through an email chain that made its way to the Prime Minister office and got noticed, and led to a set of conversations that led to her contributing and then deciding to come back. And I'll talk of KP, right? I think that you do have to do a little bit of digging. So two things before I say how you actually get to. I don't think we have a single portal, a single point, and I'm not sure that it's something we'll be able to create in a second. But before we get to, reaching out to government, because that always seems to be the knee-jerk thing. Most of you live in the States, and as far as I know, the philosophy in the States, whether you're left of center, right of center, is to try and keep government and the size and the influence of government as small as possible.
Yeah.
Let's actually start with that premise and not discount the reaching out to private sector, as well as just public to, as well as reaching out to the public sector, because by definition, the private sector has to be more dynamic, and you have something to offer, then it is worth looking at the space where it's being offered. Anyway, so that's just one thought. The second thought is, indeed, a great place to start is the incubators. In KP, when we're talking of the tech space, a great place to start indeed is the IT board. And then it depends on what you're looking for, right? I think the 2 points of contact, and they'll both be available online. If they're not, give me feedback, because we certainly ought to make them more visible, is the KP IT board and the KP board of investment, right? We have strengthened the leadership of the board of investment, and will strengthen the organization significantly to make it the sort of organization that an investor can come in front of, right? And that can then lead him through the decision to invest journey. So if there's one point that I can take away from this, is for me, if there is one singular point of contact, it should be the board of investment, which should suss out the serious to non-serious opportunities. The IT board, obviously, again, we're currently in the process of looking for a good CEO. I wish we'd had the call a little bit earlier. I would have marketed the position, and maybe someone on the call could have applied. But once the new leadership is in space, right, that's been designed as a more dynamic arm of government and should be a great point of contact. But I think when you really want to contribute, you just persevere. Government, by definition, is a slower moving machine than we would like it to be. And even when we reform it, it will remain slower moving, or it will reform slower than we actually want it. And so it is important for those of us who have a real passion to actually identify how they get through. And I'm sure that all of you sitting there, so the way I would start is to start through my network in the Bay Area to see who knows someone who can actually get me to the right conversation. Because frankly, ultimately, that's your best bet. And there's nothing, and I'm sorry if this sounds like an unsexy answer, but there's nothing to beat good old-fashioned networks and networking in terms of getting to the right place, right? And then there's nothing that beats perseverance in terms of really in terms of getting something if you really, really want it. There is the acute realization that we need help from the international diaspora, but it will require time for us to actually set up the mechanisms to be able to do this as efficiently as we would like it.
Yeah, I think, and with Park launch, I think part of the intent here is to help sort of, filter and streamline ideas and, thoughts before they come up to senior leaders back home. So hopefully, to add to what you've just said, I think there are plenty of platforms, some nascent, some well-formed, in the private sphere, where you can leverage informal networks to try and reach to those in positions of power and influence back home. Now, there's a follow-up question from one of our audience members who currently is at the Asian Development Bank, and the specific question is around these public-private partnerships in terms of building hospitals and the use of the Tehreek-e-Insaaf scheme insurance at those hospitals. So I guess to sort of break it down in terms of capacity, for healthcare services, in terms of number of beds, etc. Do you feel in KP there's a specific capacity growth that you're aiming for, where these partnerships could help you furnish the services you have on your roadmap for the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, I think it's a huge opportunity, and it's one of the reasons that we've gone down this path of universal health insurance, and it's an idea we're incredibly proud of. In fact, some of the feedback we got on it made me laugh, because the number of people who responded saying you'd win an election in the US on this, potentially, because I guess you wouldn't get much of the Republican vote. But there were 2 or 3 reasons for doing this. And one was understanding through COVID that the public sector alone isn't going to improve or deliver the quality that we need to be able to provide good, decent healthcare to everyone. Number one, right? Number 2 is we believe it's a universal right anyway. The health insurance is something that was given to about 30% of the population. But if you actually think, even if someone is earning, say, 3 to 3.5 lakh, even 4 lakh rupees a month in Pakistan, most of that income is actually not saved. So imagine a life-threatening situation such as a family member, God forbid, getting cancer, needing a liver transplant, needing heart surgery. It becomes a life-changing event. You have to sell property, you have to sell land, you have to sell a car, right? Huge impact on finances. And so in terms of providing health cover, it's not only just the poorest of the poor that need it. I think everyone, say, bar the 2 or 3%, who really amongst the topmost earners or the wealthiest people in society need that basic insurance. And in a way, it is the job of government to be able to provide that level of basic healthcare. That was the second thought. And the third thought was it should have a great impact on both the insurance industry, but also on the development of the health industry, and in incentivizing the private sector to come in and invest in healthcare, because it's in any which way an inelastic demand that, it's a sector with inelastic demand. It's a sector where the supply of quality healthcare is way smaller than the demand for quality healthcare. And remember that even poor people will go to a private hospital and pay money provided they can afford it, if they believe that it offers them better service than a government hospital. And we actually don't have the sort of or the volume of private healthcare facilities that we ought to, in addition to government facilities, to be able to actually improve the quality of services. The last thing it does with this very acute objective of trying to encourage private healthcare investment is that if the private sector does start to grow, I think it has a really good impact on improving the service delivery of the public sector as well, because of the competition effect. So all of this in mind, all we need to do is to run the right healthcare scheme, which is something we're paying a lot of attention to. It's obviously something that's very close to the Prime Minister's heart. And rollout will hopefully, unless there's any problems, begin before the end of October. Now, what are the investment opportunities? Look, the private healthcare sector is already doing well. It may surprise some of you, if you're not from Pakhtunkhwa, to know that 2 of the best private hospitals in the country are in Peshawar, right? Because again, and that shows, although you'd classify Peshawar in the sort of second set of cities in terms of population and GDP contribution after Karachi and Lahore, right? But Peshawar, because it serves the entire Pakhtunkhwa province and also serves a significant portion of the Afghan population for critical care. There were people, actually a set of Peshawar doctors who saw the opportunity here and have built 2 fantastic hospitals while at McKinsey, where we were looking at the quality of private care in Pakistan, and these 2 came out as 2 of the top run private hospitals and 2 of the most profitable private hospitals in the country. So you know that opportunity is also already there. But I would imagine that once the private sector sees the opportunity here, we're not just going to look at large tertiary hospitals, right? Because Khyber Pakhtunkhwa is a province of about 40 million people today, right? Yeah. And when you start going into the periphery, anything from sort of smaller regional facilities to bigger secondary hospitals to sort of replicating healthcare service in a chain, I'm pretty sure someone's going to be able to look at this opportunity if we can get the implementation of the insurance scheme right and pick up on it. And I hope they pick up on it because the whole idea of giving every family up to 10 lakh rupees in insurance for critical care is that it actually does good things like this to the healthcare sector. And it is something that we will be facilitating. We are already experimenting with public-private partnerships in healthcare. So it will pleasantly surprise, hopefully, some of you to know that we already had a couple of hospitals in the former tribal districts that were run in partnership through the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Health Foundation, which is actually responsible for public-private partnerships, but run by the non-government sector in the tribal districts and actually run to a pretty good standard. And we've expanded that to include 8 more hospitals, 6 in the tribal districts, 2 in Chitral, that have now just obtained their NOCs and should be starting, right? Those are examples of public-private collaboration. But I think the health insurance, other than just being, I think, just the right sort of thing to invest in, and something that we're proud of, I believe it will change the healthcare sector. Our challenge is just to do it right.
Great. There's an interesting question around, you already mentioned that Afghan patients already come to Peshawar. So do you see our, KP province potentially becoming a destination for medical tourism for, say, Central Asian patients, the way, say, Singapore or some of the other Far Eastern countries have become for the Bangladeshi or the Indonesian patients? Or is that
so I think Central Asia beyond Afghanistan at the moment, I think that's fantastic to have as a vision, but it is already served as a medical tourism hub for the Afghan population, even at times when relations have been strained. And so I think the opportunity there is much greater, and one that we are actually actively looking to tap. It's also the right thing to do. So that is something that is important. I can tell you that big hospitals in Peshawar, up to 40% of the patients tend to come from Afghanistan. So, I think that's something for potential investors to consider. The market is beyond just the market of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. The other thing, by the way, interesting that we are experimenting with, other than this, is to outsource a lot of services within government-run hospitals. So we're going to outsource waste management. We're going to outsource janitorial services, security services, other support services. We're going to outsource the operations of potentially certain medical technology, CT scans, labs, etc., to be able to both bring more dynamism to the public sector and to be able to sort of mitigate some of the traditional inefficiency of the public sector in hospitals. So again, if we get that right, and the pace that we work at is slower than we would like, and none of this should take away from the fact that we're incredibly invested in building a strong public sector, taking care of our doctors, taking care of the healthcare community, providing them better facilities, because we're incredibly proud of what they've done during the whole COVID crisis. I think it is important, although it is sometimes misunderstood, to be able to bring the power of the private sector to some of our facilities. And this was actually proven during COVID. We expanded our testing capacity during COVID from literally from 0 to about 4,000 tests a day. We don't have a lot of private labs in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. And when we actually wanted to really expand our capacity, we decided that we would actually use at government cost some of the private capacity that existed outside of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and ran the right procurement, and that allowed us at the peak to be able to do about 4,000 tests a day, with 1,000 tests a day being done by the private sector as part of the government system. And what that actually meant was no one who needed a test ever needed to pay for a test or go outside of the public healthcare system. And so I think that sort of innovation is important. We need to build our capacity to be able to do it as quickly as we want. And until that time, it will take a little bit longer to get each individual initiative up and running than we would like. But that is definitely the direction that we're going in. And for people who are serious about investing in the healthcare sector, I'd be very happy to have conversations on specific ideas. Having said that, I'll have to say, my team and I will be very happy to have those conversations, because I'm not an healthcare expert, but we do actually try to do our best, and hopefully over the next 3 years, the health sector in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa will look very different to the way it does today.
No, there's a long flurry of questions around healthcare still streaming in. So we take your message, and in some way, if we can, through our platform at Park Launch, help maybe get a summary document put together of those interested in taking the conversation further with you. We'll be happy to facilitate that. I think in the interest of time, I mean, we obviously would love to carry the conversation further, but it's a bit late on your end. So depending on whether you're still available for the next 10 odd minutes, I could either go for a quick wrap up, or your other portfolio, finance, obviously has some really interesting angles to it as well. So would you be able to go 5 minutes beyond the original?
Yeah, we can do 10 more minutes.
Okay, sounds great. So on that front, I think tax reforms been a big topic, and one of those big, hairy, audacious goals that the current government, from a federal and provincial standpoint, has taken on as a challenge. So, what's the key challenge? Because I have had some experience working with the FBR from the corporate sector, and while the intent has been there, somehow the landscape in Pakistan in terms of the the broader public and the business community somehow has this lack of trust in terms of whether their money is going to really go where it's intended for. Like even overseas Pakistanis like us who pay 45% tax sitting here in other countries, we somehow feel there's that sort of trust deficit in the Pakistani context when we go back. So what's your government done to try and sort of bridge that trust deficit? Because we can't expect overnight miracles, we get that, but are you hopeful, as someone who's in the driving seat trying to fix this really tough challenge in your provincial context? Give us some optimism or hope, if I may say that.
I'm very hopeful, and I'll actually give you more than optimism. I'll give you results and figures. Let me give you the story of the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Revenue Authority from sort of the day that I assumed this role. Finance was my primary portfolio, and the one I picked up after joining the assembly. My first meeting with the Revenue Authority, they presented me about 30 minutes of slides which showed everything on their organization chart and the number of offices they had and the number of trainings they'd done. And after 30 minutes, I told them, you realize you're talking to the finance minister of the province and you've shown him everything except what really counts, which is what the numbers are. I said, you go back and you come back and you show me what the numbers are and what your plan to grow them is. And I told them that, look, what we're actually going to do is to start a reform journey because it is incredibly important that the country work on this revenue generation problem. And we can't, as federating units, simply point to Islamabad. We've got to do our bit. Now, it's easier to do this in a province than, the smaller the organization, the fresher the organization, the easier it is to reform it. But I think you've got to understand the nuts and bolts of reform and know what you're going to do to be able to really get this done and then persevere. The first thing we did in this case was we identified that typically there are three big revenue earning departments in the provincial governments. There's the excise department, there's the revenue department, which looks at land taxes, and then there is the revenue authority, which collects sales tax on services. Because this is the one which, obviously because services represent 50% of the economy roughly, is the one with the most potential. The first step we did to actually reform it was under the umbrella of the excise department. We decided to place it under the finance department because that's where greater ownership was, and said, let's make this a case study of what happens if you actually do things right. And we did 3 or 4 things. A, we worked very closely, the chief minister and I, in terms of identifying the right head for this and then keeping that person there. B, we brought in technical expertise, both from the FBR as well as from the market. The lead advisor to KPRA used to be an ex-head of the Revenue Authority in Punjab. C, we identified a set of enablers that had to happen for reform. So filling in some of the key positions in the organization, putting in place an appellate tribunal, putting in place better technology. And so D, we put in place targets and pretty ambitious targets. So after about 6 months of putting in the nuts and bolts, we aimed last year to double revenue from 10 to 20 billion. And we internally thought we'd be happy at about 15 billion, but decided to set a stretch target and then work towards it. And then F, we actually worked, and I worked personally on this for about 6 months to put in place an incentive plan. And then the last thing that I had to perhaps personally do to embed the culture over there was to actually really start caring about the numbers. So rather than have qualitative conversations, I would hold 2 stock takes a month and really look at what the numbers were and whether the numbers had improved over the same period last year, where the growth was coming from, and if the growth wasn't coming, what could we do? Increasing registrations, looking at whether those that were meant to withhold tax were meant to, increasing the number of field audits, etc., etc., etc. And suddenly with all of this, last year we started to show 50% year-on-year growth as a minimum almost every month. And before COVID hit, we were showing about 83% growth year-on-year, June to January or June to February. I forget which one. And we're actually on track to go to a minimum of 18.5 billion. And we would actually have hit that 20 billion target. Now, in March, when COVID really hit, my focus diverted from the Revenue Authority, and there were more important things. And I assumed that the organization would end the year at about 15.5 billion max. But when by the beginning of June, I actually checked in again, they had topped 16 billion already and ended the year at 17.2 billion. And in a year of COVID, where FBR showed flat growth, I think the Punjab Revenue Authority grew at 15%, Sindh Revenue Authority grew at 4 or 5% or something. In KP, a province where the Revenue Authority had produced 10 billion a year flat for about 3 years, we showed 65% growth. And it wasn't just in the Revenue Authority. There's a cascading effect across other organizations as well. I've just looked at the reconciled figures, and overall growth for provincial revenue was from 31 to 42 billion. So almost about 33% growth across the last year. And in a year of COVID, it actually shows that if you pay attention to detail and do the right things, you can get results. And we haven't increased taxes. In fact, because so much of the service economy doesn't pay tax, you're in a position to reduce taxes in many places to encourage registration and compliance, right? But it's been a phenomenal year. And we are now hoping that this year, we will at least touch 20. And we're looking to be somewhere between 20 and 25 because of the level of uncertainty in the economy. But this is now an organization that's built. This is now an organization that's dynamic, and it was completely static just 2 years ago. Morale was low, dynamism and entrepreneurialism was low. So I think it actually shows that indeed a lot can be done. We need to give this organization its own act. We need to replicate what we've done here in terms of performance-based pay, true performance-based pay. We need to be able to hire resources from the market where we need. And it's actually a great example of putting some corporate knowledge as well as a lot of good public sector practice. So one of the things that the previous DG was moved on that would do, when I would be very bullish with the level of action that I wanted to take and say, look, this is not how things happen. I understand what you're trying to do. And what I'm going to do now is to talk to X or Y industry and bring them on board, because we've got to do this in the right way, right? And so you learn from each other, and it's actually been a fantastic journey. And I hope that by the end of this 5-year period, that we'll at least have doubled revenue in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa across, and KPRA, Revenue Authority, should have moved, in my opinion, at least from about that 10 billion baseline to about a 40 billion or so a year by the time the next elections happen, inshallah. So that is possible. And if that's possible at KPRA, it's possible in the other revenue authorities, it's possible in the FBR, but one does need to pay attention to detail and persevere.
No, that's really positive to hear, and I hope there's cross-pollination of ideas and learnings with other revenue authorities in the country at a federal and other provincial levels, and there's learning and progress there as well. To close on a slightly, say, less formal note, any good sort of book recommendations, or what are your ways of sort of keeping yourself enthused and positively energized like you do? Do you follow specific authors or blogs or anything that on leadership, on sort of leveraging your corporate sector background in the government space?
I skim through a lot of books. I buy a lot of books. I don't get as much time to read them, as I can, as I would like to. And I can tell you that it takes effort to unwind, because the challenge that one has is, when you're actually in direct politics, it's not just running the ministry, but you have to solve for the expectations of your constituents in a parliamentary system. And so that takes up a lot of free time. Try and do a little bit of sport to unwind. But amongst a bunch of other authors, I am a big cricket fan. So I still pop into Saeed Book Bank, and, belong to the generation that like to read. So I pick up the latest issue of the Cricketer that they get. I buy the annual Wisden and skim through it. And I do like to read a fair amount of the sort of smart thinking, or I don't read a lot of fiction, but a fair amount of stuff on not necessarily just leadership, but both on the economy. And there's a lot of smart thinking books out there that are fascinating. My favorite authors, I haven't missed any single one of his books, is Tim Harford, who first authored The Undercover Economist. And I think his last book that I read was 50 Things That Changed the Modern Economy. That is something that is worth reading. One of the best books that I've read in the last year or so is Grit by Angela Duckworth. I thought that was a fantastic read, because it is certainly something that one has to show in terms of trying to go along this journey of helping to change Pakistan. But it's also something that is important if you're in a high pressure career, whatever it is. And amongst the few fiction books that I have read in the last few years, the one that touched me the most was Khalid Hosseini's the Kite Runner, which I'm sure many have read, because it's about our part of the world. It's something that felt relatively familiar. So no great surprises there. One last book that I think is worth reading is Why Nations Fail. Is, I think, a great read on how institutions are important to national success. I forget the name. I don't. The names of one of the authors is too difficult to pronounce off the top of my head, but you can Google it, and it's a fantastic read. So that's a few of the pieces of literature that come top of mind as you ask that question.
No, thank you so much, Taimur. It's been an absolute pleasure conversing with you. And I guess on behalf of the community, one thing I can tell you is that, seeing people like you sort of be the face for the country, for the province, it is invigorating for people like us sitting abroad, because we feel not only do you get what we think and what we feel for the country, you have that ambition, that desire, and that sort of, that exposure to really drive the country forward. So, I think most of us around here don't really watch talk shows and things of that sort, but it would be really inspiring for people to, get to see a bit more of people like you in the government sector, because that gives us that sense of, optimism and hope that, it's not just the usual cat fight that we see on the media. There's other, people out there who are doing good stuff without really trying to hog the limelight. So if I could request anything on behalf of the community, we'd love to see more of you, and hopefully in 3 to 6 months time we get to host you again. Thanks once again.
It's been an honor, and hopefully I can at least try to live up to expectations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, and Allah Hafiz everyone. Apologies to some of the audience members whose questions I couldn't delve into, because I think the gist of what they were asking you had already covered. So thank you.